Today's Bible reading continues on from what we just heard from Lisa in the kids' spot. God has sent Nathan to David to reveal the full extent of his sin. And although God has forgiven David, curse hangs over his house. It's no longer a house of blessing, but a house of curse. So our reading is from 2 Samuel chapter 12, and we start at verse 15. If you've got the Black Church Bible, it's on page 311. So read along with me. 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting at verse 15. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the night lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. But David noticed that his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realised the child was dead. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. His attendants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now the child is dead, you get up and eat." He answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. Joab then sent messages to David saying, "I have fought against Rabbah and have taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise, I will take the city and it will be named after me." So David mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. David took the crown from the king's head, and it was placed on his own head. It weighed a talent of gold, and it was set with precious stones. David took a great quantity of plunder from the city and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labour with saws and with iron picks and axes. He made them work at brickmaking. David did this to all the Ammonite towns. Then he and his entire army returned to Jerusalem.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start today with a confession from something in my past. When I was at uni, and I was not long out of school, and I hadn't long been driving, I had to drop one day my younger sister off at school. She was a couple of years younger than me, and this school was on this dead-end street, this cul-de-sac, quite a narrow street, and I had to drive into this section where it was really narrow and there were cars parked on either side, and I dropped her off, and as I was turning around and coming back, I accidentally bumped a parked car. It wasn't that bad, but there was a mark, and I freaked out. I hadn't done this before, and I didn't think anyone had seen me, so I did it. I was that guy. I kept driving. I drove away. And I didn't really think about it much throughout the day, but then I had to come back in the afternoon to pick my sister up. And as I was waiting for her, one of my former teachers came out and confronted me. He'd seen me in the morning, and he recognised my car, and he made me go and confront the owner of the car, which was one of the students in my sister's year, a guy a couple of years younger than me, but twice my size, really could have decked me, and really into cars. He'd been working on this car and doing this car up. And the teacher basically said to the guy, "Ryan, I saw him bump your car this morning and he drove away, and now I've brought him to you." It was humiliating. We had to go out and look at the car. The guy said, "Oh, don't worry about it, it'll be fine." But my sister found out about it, my parents found out about it, and I remember feeling really bad, and I said to my mum, "I just feel really bad about what I did." And my mum, with that look of disappointment, looked at me and said, "No, you don't, you're just upset you got caught." I'm glad you find it funny. I was cut, to my heart, because not only had my action been found out, but my selfish heart had been found out. Shame, exposure. We've all done this, haven't we? We've all hidden stuff about ourselves that we don't want people to see. We put on this mask to try and look good and pretend that no one can see the ugly stuff. And it feels really horrible when someone rips the mask off. Now, we understand that it can be a good thing when the mask gets ripped off. It's uncomfortable, but it can be good. We're living in a time where people are ripping masks off more than ever before, particularly off the powerful people who cover up things that they've been doing. So in recent years, the Me Too movement has been exposing not just instances, but a culture of sexual abuse and harassment that had been covered up for years or even decades. Currently, there is an investigation in the US into allegations of corruption in the Trump administration's election, and people arguing about who did what and what's the truth and finding out who's responsible. And of course, close to home, the exposure in Australia of one of the most powerful religious leaders in our country covering up sexual abuse from decades before. And there's an awareness in our culture that enough is enough and the masks have to come off. Well, we are continuing in our series looking at the story of 2 Samuel, the story of King David on the throne of Israel. And last week, if you were with us, we saw David abuse his power. He's forced a woman into his bed, and then to cover up the pregnancy that resulted, he has committed murder of her husband. And it looks like that he's gotten away with it. He has these servants around him who are covering up for him, and he's sitting on this throne looking good. And you see, David is not just any king. Right? He is God's choice of king, what the Bible calls the Messiah, this chosen king given a role of ruling over God's kingdom and representing God and enacting God's love and justice in the world, a king called a shepherd of God's people, leading, caring for, and protecting God's people. Centuries later, Jesus would speak of our need for a good shepherd, one who will lay down his life for his sheep, one who will stand up and defend his sheep, even at cost to his own life. That's what people need. And here we have David sitting in that role, but David has become a wolf disguised as a shepherd. Everyone sees this good shepherd, and now he has the power and he has the opportunity to take and use his sheep whenever he wants. What happens when the powerful people get away with it? It's devastating for others, isn't it? What happens when God's king gets away with it? What impact does that have on others and on us? And what about God? Where is he in all this? There's a common idea out there in society that God is just a tool. The idea of God is a tool that powerful people use to justify and cover up their evil. But today we see that that is not the truth about God at all. And in this story we see that it's God who turns up, the only one who turns up, to do something about it. And the first thing that God does is to expose David's crime. And he sends the prophet Nathan, we heard it in the kids' talk, to David. A prophet is someone who speaks to David for God. And he tells this story of two men. One has a lot of sheep and cattle. He's a wealthy farmer, a powerful guy. And then there's a poor man who only has one little lamb who he loves and he raises like a child as part of the family. Really cares for her. And the rich man, the wealthy guy, has this guest come and stay, and he's meant to provide a meal for the guest, and he has all these sheep and cattle, and it won't cost him that much. But why cost a little when you can cost nothing? And he sees the guy with the one little lamb, and when that guy's not watching, he takes the lamb, he cuts its throat, and he cooks it, and the guy eats it. Just this callous, cold-hearted response by a guy who has too much wealth and power and can get away with it. And David, when he hears this story, he burns with anger at what the guy did. As surely as the Lord lives, that's a really powerful oath. If God is real, then the man who did this must die. He had more than he could possibly need. He saw someone with hardly anything, vulnerable, knew how precious this lamb was to him. And just this cold, ruthless, pitiless heart took from the one who had so little, so he didn't have to give up anything himself. And that kind of thing makes your blood boil. And David's blood is boiling here. And we can see what's happening here, can't we? Right? God has sent Nathan to go hunting, and he set a trap for a wolf, and the wolf has just walked right into it. Because God is about to expose David's corruption, not just to other people, but to David himself. You see, the thing about masks that we put on, and that other people allow us to put on, we're not just hiding the truth from other people, but from ourselves. Our hearts love to lie to ourselves about what we're really like and the kind of people we really are. And so we put on these masks to convince everyone else that we're good, so that then we can look in the mirror and tell ourselves that we're good and not see the truth. It's ridiculous. David is getting self-righteously angry at a guy for killing a lamb when he has just committed murder, when he has forced a woman into his bed. But that's what our hearts do. We bury the truth about ourselves so that we can feel good about ourselves while we allow the evil to continue. And God is in the business of ripping off the masks. You are the man, says Nathan. Picture it. Can you picture this conversation? As I read this story growing up, I always imagined this conversation taking place between Nathan and David in private. But I actually think this picture is much more accurate. That the mask is ripped off in public and everyone around David has to see. Because the wolf is not allowed to continue doing this under cover of darkness. David cannot be allowed to just continue to use people and take from people under this front of goodness. And so that David cannot hide from himself who he really is. He has to see who he is. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. He has to face what he has done. See, when I bumped the car and I was found out and my mum said, you don't feel bad about what you did, the truth is I didn't feel bad about what I did until I got found out. But when I got found out, I actually did. Because when everyone else can see me, then I have to look at me as well. I can't pretend. And I see the kind of person I've really become. You can't hide the facts from yourself when everyone else is looking at them. And so that is what God has done. But God isn't finished. Exposing David prevents him continuing this evil under a mask, but it can't deal with the evil that has already been committed, and there is a stain there. And so judgment is going to fall, and God judges David. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. And because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. And David's family are going to be hit by a sword, by violence and death. And in the weeks to follow, we will see that it is his sons who are going to cop this. And this is really hard, right? I've always really struggled with this passage. This is probably one of the darkest bits of the Old Testament, which is pretty dark. And I feel like I've drawn the short straw this week with this talk. David does all this evil, and it's not him who's going to die for that sin, but all these other people are going to die. And why the baby? Why that son? What does that mean? That is so hard. I think of my own son, Hugo. And especially if you're here today and you've suffered the loss of a child. What is this passage saying? Is it saying that God was punishing you for doing something? What is this about? Well, no, it's not saying that. We've got to remember that this is a story about David, and David had a particular role. David was to be the shepherd king. He was to rule with God's love and righteousness. He was to have this special relationship with God, of loving God and then leading other people to love God. And within this relationship of love, because of that, God made a promise to David, and we saw it 2 weeks ago, that from him a son would come and be king after him. And this son would have a kingdom forever, a shepherd dynasty, where God's rule and his love and blessing would flow to people in the world. A kingship that's different from the other kingships of the world, based in love for God. But now David has despised God. That means he has treated God as nothing. He has treated God as worthless. He wants to have the kingdom, and he wants the promise for his sons, and he wants the power, but he can do away with God. God is nothing to him. His heart has become cold and dead to God. He wants to be a king like every other king with the perks of being God's special king, and it doesn't work like that. Now, this passage has some comfort that there's a hint that David seems convinced that this child has gone to be with God, where I am going when I die. That is where the baby is. But David's rejection of God means that judgment will fall, and his rejection of the God who gave him the promise means judgment falls on the promise. God's promise is for a righteous king within this relationship with God that David has despised. Now, God is not the cause of evil. We see that across the Bible. In this story, David is the cause of evil, but there are consequences that come from our evil. And if you're still angry that it's David's failure that leads to judgment falling on the people around him, then feel that. Because that is the point. Because that is what happens when the shepherd king, God's king, fails. Judgment falls on everyone else. When the promise fails. Because without that promise in that relationship with that king, then judgment falls on all of us for the ways that we have despised God and treated God as nothing and become people of shame. For the ways that we have hidden the stuff, the ugly stuff, behind masks of goodness. And looking good and calling ourselves good, we have seen people and used people and taken people for ourselves and hidden it. God sees, and it cannot be allowed to continue. And it won't continue. How are we all feeling? God's judgment is heavy. It's not a popular topic. It's not nice, but it matters. And it matters because it's the state of all people, of humanity. And it matters to talk about because it's not the end of the story. God judges evil, yes. But God's judgment is always about clearing out the bad to make way for something good. And there is a ray of light in this story. It's very faint in this story, but it will rise into a dawn, into a brand new day. And the ray of light that we see doesn't come from David, but from God and from God's love. We read that after this, David comforts Bathsheba, and she gives birth to a son, another son, and the Lord loves him. There's devastation everywhere, but the promise is not over. David demolishes it, but God's love holds onto it by a thread. And this son, Solomon, is loved by God. Now he will grow up and fail to be the righteous son as well. But God's love for him is a promise that this mess is not going to continue forever. And that because of God's love, there will be a righteous son who will fulfill the promise and who will bring blessing to us instead of curse. And centuries later, a descendant of David would come, and did come, Jesus. And he was baptized, and after he was baptized, heaven opened, and a God spoke from heaven and said, "You are my son, whom I love." See, Jesus is God's son, and Jesus is the shepherd that we've been waiting for. Not a fake, not a wolf under cover of darkness, a shepherd who walks in the daylight. A shepherd who embodies God's love and God's care. I am the good shepherd, says Jesus. And I am the one who lays down my life for my sheep. Jesus, the one who lets go of what he could want for himself, and lays down his life for the sake of those he came to care for, so that judgment will not fall on us. Because it fell on him. See, whatever shame you carry today, the Good Shepherd laid down his life to get rid of that shame. He carried it on himself and he took it to a cross. He was exposed to the world as an object of shame, and he was judged and he died. We're going to sing about this in a few minutes. The innocent judged guilty, while the guilty one walks free. Jesus takes the punishment that our shame deserves, but it's not just that. It's not like he takes our punishment away so that we can continue on living these shameful lives, selfish lives, and get away with it. No, he takes our shame into the ground, into the grave, and then he rose to new life. And he walked out of the grave, but he left our shame in there. And he calls us to walk away from the old way of life into something new, a new way of life. A way of life that follows in the way of the love of our shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, says Jesus. This new life is found in being the sheep of Jesus, in being his flock, in finding your life joined to him and following his voice and following in his way of life. And when you do that, you don't keep going on in darkness, the mask comes off. And you become different, you become changed. It's kind of like, it was described to me once as if you hold your fist closed, there's darkness inside. And how do you get rid of the darkness? Well, you open your hand and light floods in. And when we come to Jesus and take off our masks, his light floods in and changes us. And he leads us in a new path that is full of light. A life that is not shameful, a life that is becoming more and more beautiful as we more and more live in his love for others. And so how do we do that? How do we do that? We trust in God's love alone. Let me say that again. You need to trust in God's love alone. If you want a life free of shame, it cannot come from your own self. That can only lead to more hiding and covering up. The life free of shame comes from bringing your shame to the one who took it into the grave and buried it there. And that means that trusting in God's love means you can't trust in the masks you're hiding behind anymore. The masks have to come off. And first they have to come off before God. We need to come to God with empty hands. No lies and no fronts, which is not about being religious. You might be here today and you've never come before God before. Perhaps you're here and you feel like you could never be accepted by God. There's too much stuff. Or you might have felt like you've never needed God because you've covered it all up and you think you've thought that you're good and you're fine. Make today the day that you come to Him. Come without bringing anything good of yourself. You come just with the mess. You lay it down before Him. You say, I need your love. That's all I got. And you will find His love for you and it will wash you clean. Take that step today. Or you might be a Christian here today and you know all about God's love and you know how to talk about His forgiveness and how He takes away shame, but you're really acting before God. In private, when you talk to God, you tell Him what you think He wants you to hear so that He will accept you. Or more likely, if you feel like you don't really need Him, you're not talking to Him at all when no one's watching. We need to come to God with empty hands and be honest with God. That is what He wants from us. Lay it down. Say, this is all I've got, this mess. I need your love. And you'll find His love and you'll find it fill you and start to change you. But see, if we do that, the masks also have to come off with each other as well. You know how you can live in a city and be in a crowd, but no one actually know you? We are living in a time where we are more connected than ever before, but in every way that matters, we are more disconnected than almost any generation in history. And we can do that as a church too. We come here and we talk to people and we chat and we go away from here and no one really knows us. No one really knows what is going on the inside. Of course they don't. It's terrifying. All these people who have their lives together, if they see me and what's in my heart, and so we bury it and we hope that no one sees, and if we do that, it gets bigger and bigger and comes out in the end. But what happens if we start taking off the mask with each other? There may be consequences. That's true, and they're difficult. We might learn some things about ourselves that we'd rather not see. A lot comes down to the kind of church community we are. Are we a community that will just smash someone for sharing something that they're going through? And if we do that, then we're just hiding behind masks, pretending we don't have our own stuff. Or are we a community that will walk alongside each other? Yes, we're going to walk out of this into something good. Let's do it together. What David really needed was brothers and sisters who spoke into his life with love rather than being silent and helping cover it up and looking the other way. And we need that too. And we don't do that by just kind of spraying our stuff everywhere over all of us. We need to develop appropriate relationships with someone who we can talk with about real stuff and open up and talk to God together. Walk alongside each other. That's where you open your fist and the light comes in. Friendships that get beneath the surface, that are about mutual sharing and mutual praying and keeping each other accountable. And not just sharing what's going on, but reminding each other and pointing each other to what God has done. And how if we have put our trust in Jesus, we are new people. And we have been washed clean. And we have this new way before us. And we can start stepping into that. Is there someone that you can start building a friendship like that with? Someone you can start catching up with, sharing with. It's a lot easier when there becomes a culture of people doing that with each other. Let's pray together about that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you because of Jesus, and it's really hard for us to think about judgment and what